Just a little housekeeping before we get started. Please silence any devices. Also, if you have any trouble hearing tonight, please let us know, raise your hand. We also have assisted hearing devices that do make it quite a bit easier. And we'll also be passing out some index cards and pencils if you have a question that you'd like to ask at some point. And you can also just raise your hand for those and we'll be coming around. You're just in time. Hi. Wonderful. So thank you all so much for coming this evening. My name is Ann Scott. I'm the Executive Director of the Nantucket Athenaeum, and I'd love to welcome you again to this beautiful, historic Great Hall, which has played host to great minds for nearly 200 years. We have Nan and Chuck Geschke to thank for their vision and generosity. They made this series possible with the help of a matching NEA grant. And on behalf of the Athenaeum, just can't say thank you enough to you and your family, Nan, for all that you've done for us. And also very special thanks to the Geschke Series season ticket holders and to sponsors of our new summer tradition, Weekend at the Library. And to all of you who purchased a ticket this evening, it takes your continued support in order to offer exciting summer programming like this, as well as serve our island community with public library services all year long. I'd like to thank Ann Taylor, who could not be with us this evening. She's an Athenaeum trustee and a newly appointed chair of the Development Committee, and she made the introduction of Michael Suarez to the Athenaeum, and we're proud to introduce him to you. He's the director of the Rare Book School at the University of Virginia. He's a distinguished scholar and an award-winning poet. And I'm sure tonight is going to be a really lively talk about the power of the physical book and of the archive to instill wonder. And we can never have too much wonder. And, that's something as physical book lovers in general, many of us can relate to. Please help me welcome Michael Suarez.
So much. What a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Ann Scott, for your gracious hospitality, and thank you, Nan, for your vision in all this. Interesting. No. It worked before. It really did. Let's do this. Let's turn it off and turn it on. I'm an English professor, so this is probably the full thing I know how to do is turn it off and turn it on. That's interesting. No lo sé. Keyboard setup assistant. Really? Okay, let's continue. Okay. Press the key immediately to the right of the shift key. I don't know what that is. Oh, I see. Okay, well, that looks like option. I don't know. On the left side of the keyboard. That I don't know. Okay, or that, or that. Don't know. All right, doesn't want to recognize that. I don't know why. And we're going to plan B. The best laid plans of mice and men. I'll stand behind here. Greetings, everybody. I apologize for the snafu. There will only be 7 more of these problems during the talk. Ooh, that doesn't work either. It all worked during the rehearsal, said he. There we go. Okay, let's see what happens. So I'd like to remember a longtime Nantucket friend, Hans Tausig, who was the chair of the Rare Book School Board of Directors, the inaugural chair indeed, and from 1962 onward came to Nantucket every year. And through the Frank Foundation, he and his wife, Eva Maria, have done tremendous work to improve the culture of Nantucket, particularly through the music scene. And Hans was a dear, dear friend. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging him. But also, this should set the theme for us tonight, because I want to show you and talk about some old friends. Those old friends happen to be smelly old books, and see what they might do for us in terms of, I'd like to pose a problem. How do we revivify the humanities? The humanities are in grave trouble. Enrollments are sinking fast and have been for the last 30 years. So now, how do we get students back in the classroom? I think I know the answer. Having taught my first college class in 1987, been at this a while, and I think I know how to inculcate wonder in our students again, how to give them a sense of the pastness of the past by helping them understand that history always, 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 if we allow it to, has, in the words of Mr. Shakespeare, a local habitation and a name. Here we are, ladies and gentlemen, in Nantucket, and one of the signal events of the early 19th century, which will be known to you all, is the sinking of the whale ship Essex, which was staved by a sperm whale. You will know better than I the grisly tale. Men in a rowboat for 89 days, starving to death, eating human flesh, and so on. A terrible, terrible story that made the press and inspired one Herman Melville to write Moby Dick. But the story of Moby Dick is way more complicated than a brilliant author reading an historical source and inventing something new. So let's see what's going on. The first edition of Moby Dick looks like this. Huh? Looks like this? It's not called Moby Dick, it's called The Whale. It's not published in America, this quintessentially American book. Problem. So what's going on? Well, there's no international copyright in 1851, and Melville sends the proof sheets to Bentley here. And what does he do? Bentley omits 35 passages from Melville's book. He mangles many others. They want to publish the English edition first because the copyright laws in England are much better and stronger than the copyright laws in the United States. Although, as many of you will know, copyright exists in the United States Constitution, not to protect authors, but to ensure that the reading public has reliable texts to consume. In other words, the original thinking about intellectual property is less about author rights than to ensure and secure the common good. How far we have fallen, but that's by the way. So the epilogue is entirely omitted. So people who are reading the British edition of the book are like, well, who's telling the story? I thought Ishmael was there, but then everybody dies at the end. So what's happening here? Wrong whale on the cover. All the stuff that was in the front of the book is printed in the back of the book. It's a complete hash. And it's a hash because it's rushed. And it's rushed because the British edition has to be antecedent to the American edition for the copyright laws to come into force the way Melville and his American publisher want them to come into force. Okay, everybody with me? So, but this is how the book ends here. And okay, like all of a sudden you're like, what, huh? Makes no sense. Makes no sense at all. And people were completely flummoxed by this book. Really. Qu'est-ce que c'est? I promised you 7 snafus. I don't really understand why sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but we're gonna do this anyway. In fact, why don't we get rid of that and put this far away and see what happens. So here's one review, probably the worst review, but this is in the London Athenaeum. Ill-compounded mixture, disfigured by mad rather than bad English, carelessness, monstrosities. We have little more to say in reprobation of recommendation of this absurd book. Now, maybe you read Moby Dick in college and you think, yeah, that's right. I'm not so sure. It's one of my favorite books. Mr. Melville has to thank himself only if his horrors and his heroics are flung aside by the general reader as so much trash belonging to the worst school of bedlam literature. Well, America's young country, still, relatively speaking, for the literary scene, and this has a tremendous impact on the American reception of the book. In the 40 years after the publication of the English and American editions, 4,000 odd copies of the book are sold in 2 countries. That's it. That's the whole thing. In other words, the book tanks. And the book tanks, this book tanks in America, partly because of the English reception of the book. What do we learn from this? We learn that forms affect meanings. The form of the book affects the reception of the book. And in this case, the form of the book was mangled and the reception is mangled. And because forms affect and effect culturally instantiated meanings, ladies and gentlemen, we can never understand the production and reception of a book by prescinding from the original textual artifacts. The key way to reinvigorate the study of the humanities, I submit to you, is to put students back into special collections, back into the multi-million-dollar laboratories on college campuses and in major cities. They might be called public libraries, and to get students to be in contact once again with the historicity of history by being in close hands-on contact with the historical record. So Moby Dick is nothing. It's dead in the water, so to speak. But what happens in 1926, R.R. Donnelly and Co., the Chicago publisher, decides to mount a special publishing program for 4 great American books. And one Rockwell Kent decides, a great American book illustrator, decides to undertake Moby Dick. He works on it for 5 years solid, making 800 wood engravings. And here you see the Lakeside Press Moby Dick, which I submit to you is one of the most beautiful books ever made in America. And this book, even before it's published, captivates the American public, and a little small trade publisher called Random House takes it on for simultaneous release. The 1,000 copies published by the Lakeside Press sell out in less than 6 months, and the Rockwell Kent Moby Dick goes through 54 editions in less than 25 years. It is a phenomenon. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, Rockwell Kent's Moby Dick reanimates and restores, or at least creates a new place for this classic text, Moby Dick. And you can see here, it's an astonishingly powerful rendering, stark, sometimes macabre, always trying to get the reader to think hard about what's really happening in the text. We know that illustrations are interpretations, and this is an interpretation of a great work, but one that becomes canonical. So much so that Robert Frost in 1947 wrote, "Oh, you mean Moby Dick by Rockwell Kent that everybody's reading? Where is Herman Melville here?" So we need to ask ourselves, who is the author? What is the author? And how do we think about this book as a coalescence of human intentions? Every book is a coalescence of human intentions. I don't know if there's a tattoo parlor here in Nantucket town, but if there is, and you are interested in book history, somewhere put on your body in the spirit of Queequeg, perhaps. Every book is a coalescence of human intentions, and understanding those intentions, recovering those intentions, is the serious business of book history, and puts the humanity back into the humanities. So a brilliant man named W.H. Auden, who many of you will know, was once asked what he thought was the most humanistic of all the humanities. And Mr. Auden said, "Well, that's easy. It's philology." And they said, "Philology? That sounds quite boring. Why?" And Auden, learned man that he was, said, "Philology, because every word, when studied closely enough, becomes a little lyric about itself. That's a darn good answer. But I actually think that the most humanistic of all the humanities is the study of the archive, is bibliography, the formal analysis of text and book history. So we've been taught for years to read. When we go to university, we're taught to read the linguistic codes of the book. Call me Ishmael, and I alone have survived to tell ye. Now you don't have to read the book. So we've been taught to read the language of the book, but the book is also made up of bibliographical codes, paper, format. Is it a folio or a little duodecimo, a little companionable 16mo that fits in your pocket? Um, uh, what are the bibliographical codes of the book? I have here that I'm going to pass around for you two books that belong to me, so you can't really hurt them and go to jail. This is volume 19 of the Ladies' Library, published in Paris in 1788. The year before, something happened in Paris in 1789, and it is a beautiful little book done in gold edges, sprinkled calf, and it's a book made for women who are from the cultural elite, the very women who would be overturned in the French Revolution. And here's a little book of classical poetry from 1571. And I thought you should take a look at these. Why? Because if we're going to talk about the hands-on study of the book, then it seems to me that you should have actually something to scrutinize. But the paper and the type and the illustration are themselves redolent of human makers and those makers' decisions. Every book is an instantiation of what the people making the book thought about the audience and what they thought about the author. And every book is also made up, if you will, not only of linguistic codes and of bibliographical codes, but also of social codes. That is to say, when you go into the airport and you see a certain kind of novel and the man is very brawny, you'll need to use your imagination. And he has no shirt on. And he's standing there holding the hands of this beautiful woman with big hair wearing a gown that's partially torn away. And the plantation is burning in the background. You know that's a Harlequin romance. And the book is saying to you, I am a Harlequin romance right away, right? Because the social codes, the size of the book, the typography of the book, the kind of cover illustration, everything about it is telling you what it is. That's a social code. Aldus Manutius in 1500 in Venice is exploiting all three of these things in his revolutionary book-selling business too. So the book is an object that's subject to interpretation by us. The book is a form of object that, except for coins, from the medieval period on, survives in the largest numbers of any artifact in human history. So why, if we wish to revivify the humanities, would we not return to the book? So one cannot occupy this stage and not think about this gentleman here. This remarkable book, published by Frederick Douglass, is published while he still has the legal status of a slave because of the fugitive slave law. This is antecedent to his coming 4 times, no less, to the Nantucket Athenaeum to speak. But he publishes this book in 1845, and within 4 months, he's on a ship to the UK. Standard reason for that everybody will adduce is he needs to get out of Dodge because of the fugitive slave law. It's certainly the case. There's another reason, however, and that reason is tied up in an antecedent book. And that book is the first great autobiography by a slave, Equiano's interesting narrative. And Equiano himself went on the world's first book tour. Here you see the stops. I haven't had a t-shirt made of this, but here you see the stops that Equiano went on, and he was able to feed his wife and to earn a living by selling books at all of these places when he went on tour. He had a Dublin edition printed, very much like Mr. Frederick Douglass. Douglass's autobiography, especially the first one, is mapped on to Equiano's autobiography. Print breeds print. Equiano goes on the first documented book tour we know of and is able to make a living. Douglass goes on a book tour to Ireland and the UK and finds the same result. The oppressed working man identifies with the lot of the slave, and in Douglass's case, he raises enough money and has the support of a group of philanthropic women, and his freedom is bought and he is manumitted. We cannot understand any one book in isolation, for books are always in conversation, each with the other. If only we know the complex story, the story of the London edition of Moby Dick, the whale, and its relationship to the story of the Boston edition of Moby Dick. The story of Frederick Douglass's Boston autobiography and the story of Equiano's London autobiography, many years antecedent, but the blueprint, the pattern, and the practice for the first great American slave autobiography. So my aim, ladies and gentlemen, again and again, is to help students recover the human presences in every recorded text. And because every text is not made by an author, authors do not make books. Authors create manuscripts that communities of makers turn into books. Type founders and pressmen, paper makers, lofty patrons, and lowly hawkers. Every book is the product of a community of makers, which is why Mr. Auden is not thoroughly correct in giving his answer, philology. What are the human presences in the recorded text? Here's a good example. Many of you will know Andre Palladio, the great architect, but few of you might know that he had teenage boys, and he wanted to teach his teenage boys how to become what he was, a great master draftsman, a great engraver, a great maker of books. And so what did he do? He bought the privilege of using a text of Caesar's Wars, and he said, boys, you're going to illustrate this book, and I'm going to be your banker. I'm going to teach you how to do this, and then you're going to follow me in my trade. The perfect book for 2 teenage boys to illustrate the encampments, the battles, the stuff of daring do that they would enjoy doing. All was going well. The year is 1572. In the space of a week, Palladio tells us in his Latin preface, the two boys are taken by the plague, and the father's heart is broken. He cannot work for a year, and he decides the only way to deal with his loss is to take up his gravure and to complete the work that his sons began, the work that was to be their apprenticeship. And he publishes the book in 1575. Every book is alive with the judgments of its makers. Every book has multiple stories to tell if only we will look at them, attend to them closely. Will we give our students a paperback edition of Euclid's Elements? Sure, maybe to understand its contents, but if we want Euclid's Elements to have a local habitation and a name, to understand with our students the pastness of the past and to give them an experience of that pastness, we might look at the 1482 Rodholt Editio Princeps, the first edition, which is a magnificent piece of printing. Nobody really knows to this day exactly how Rodholt was able to, how he figured out how to make these complex diagrams. We know that the manuscript editions of this book were deeply defective because the scribes, ladies and gentlemen, were highly adept at copying letter forms, but they didn't know anything about Euclidean geometry, and they skipped whenever they could copying the diagrams lest they make a mistake. And Rodholt collates 36 manuscripts and goes through the text himself, paragraph by paragraph, to figure out what the visual information must be to accompany the printed information, and this creates a revolution in mathematics. This is an old friend, but an important one. So too, Hooke's Micrographia, the first book published by the Royal Society, it becomes an instant bestseller and gets people obsessed in England with the new fad of microscopy. And all of a sudden, people can't believe, many are horrified that there are monsters lurking in their bed, monsters that the eye cannot perceive, that there is a hidden world, as Cavendish says, Margaret Cavendish says. But the form and the meaning of the book, the hyper magnification here of the flea with this huge pull-out engraving is a classic example of the way that forms and meanings are inextricably linked. Samuel Pepys was obsessed by this book. Of all the thousands of books that he read, he thought this was the single most ingenious book that he had read. I remember reading the New York Times. I'm an avid reader of the New York Times, and a physician complained, a physician who was teaching residents and fellows in neuropathology, that these young men and women were brilliant at looking at screens and horrible at diagnosing actual brains. And he said, okay, we're going to have a dissection lab every Wednesday. We're going to put brains on the table and study them, because you don't know anything about the human brain, because you only know about pictures of human brains. And this is another flaw in our teaching of the humanities today. We give students pictures pictures from the internet instead of letting them handle the real thing. But when they had to do the gross anatomy of the human brain and have it on the table, the physician says it's like the difference between looking at maps of a place and driving around it. I left the UK 14 years ago to become the executive director of a school that's dedicated to the hands-on study of the book, precisely for this self-same reason. The hands-on study of the book, the inculcation of wonder. We cannot give our students the Norton Anthology of English Literature and say, imagine what this might have been like in the age of Chaucer. It's not gonna fly, ladies and gentlemen. Imagine if I give you a loaf of Wonder Bread and ask you to imagine the beauty of a field of wheat. You can't do it. It's too divorced from its origin. And so too, it seems to me, by bringing people back into the hands-on investigation of the grubbiness and specificity of human history, like Vesalius's Great Anatomy here from 1543, a book in which its cover you see he's dissecting a human person in front of a multitude of people. The great Vesalius is 28 years old when he publishes this book, and he becomes internationally famous. Why? Because he says physicians are making mistakes again and again and again because they're only looking at pictures and they're not putting their hands on bodies. And so Vesalius publishes this book with detailed instructions, but he also publishes this epitome. Here's a beautiful hand-colored copy at Cambridge University, which is meant to be put up in the dissecting room wall in order to help people learn hands-on. Ladies and gentlemen, why should the scientists have all the fun? Ladies and gentlemen, why should the STEM people get to be in laboratories and the humanities people be confined to classrooms? I myself was trained as an evolutionary biologist, spent a lot of time in the laboratory, and it was great. But the humanities, one just sat in a classroom and talked about ideas completely divorced from their historical origins. What a shame. Also in 1543, a guy named Nicholas Copernicus told the world that the sun was at the center of the universe and revolutionized, in his book De Revolutionibus, revolutionized the world. Owen Gingerich, professor of historical astronomy at Harvard University, was told that nobody read this book. Nobody ever read this book. So he went hands-on and spent 20 years trying to look at every known copy of the first and second edition. He wrote an amazing book called The Book Nobody Read, in which he proves that hundreds of scientists read and annotated copies of De Revolutionibus, that it had a profound impact. But the only way he could know was by looking at old books. The tale he tells is a fascinating quest. The tale he tells is a model for us for the doing of hands-on history. The humanities tend to be an isolated prospect, but if we send people into the library and archive, we can create teams of investigation. We can inculcate wonder in our students. It seems to me that knowledge and wonder together conduce toward love. Our aim should not be to explain away the power of the work before us. Our aim should be to create the conditions of possibility for an experience that the students will find indelible. So we've all spent time hearing about the cod liver oil theory of the humanities. You should do it because it's good for you. You should do it because society needs it. How's that going, huh? How's that going? Just down the road in Massachusetts, 6% of the freshman class this year at Harvard University say they're going to become humanities majors. 6%. How's that? Not so good, huh? Why? Because we tell them it's good for you instead of telling them you could make stuff. Instead of telling them you could understand historical processes. Instead of telling them you could understand human labor and recover the decisions that men and women made in order to create durable cultural artifacts 400 years ago. The infrastructure for this already exists. It's called the public library. It's in places like this that the humanities will either rise and fall. It's not in some dry classroom. We come to a place like the Nantucket Athenaeum. We look at a book that was owned by princes and kings, and yes, the nobility of America, if we could say there was such a thing in the 18th century, and we begin to look at copies of their books. And this book, although it seems to be the same, once we begin to look, is different every single time. We learn about making. We get our hands dirty because the world should be a laboratory, not a museum. We help people who are makers teach us to experience and to understand in new ways. We use the affordances of the digital, like in the manuscript copy in the Library of Congress of Mr. Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Citizen, insurrection of our fellow smudged, written over. What happened here? Well, through the affordances of multispectral imaging, we can discover that what Jefferson wrote underneath was subject. And having called you and me a subject, Jefferson immediately realized the error of his ways. He smudged it out and he wrote over in pen several times, citizens. And in this moment, the United States of America was in effect born, not subjects, citizens. So how could we use the tools at our disposal today in order to see differently? How could we use the tools at our disposal to revivify humanistic inquiry? The main tool is the beauty and power of the book. The main tool is to help our students understand the human presences in every recorded text. The main objective must be to inculcate wonder by understanding every text as a coalescence of human intentions and something that can change our students' lives. Thank you very much. I would be happy to take questions, and they don't even need to be on little cards.
Just raise your
Please. Mm-hmm. So the Rockwell Kent one from 1930, he spent a lot of time reading Moby Dick. He read the book apparently 4 times, which is a heroic act. It seems to me, much as I like it. He made these 800 wood engravings. Um, he designed the mise en page, what we might call the layout of the book. Um, but the copy text of for the book was the American first edition. The copy text for the book was the American first edition because that was what was considered the reliable text, whereas, as I hope I've adduced for you, the British first edition was profoundly unreliable. There's a later instance, however, Nan, that this chap named F.O. Matheson, who was the dean of American literature, wrote an essay uh, about this phrase called in Moby Dick, the soiled fish of the sea, and how Moby Dick was this, the white was maculate, and this was the quintessential Melvillian moment that he wrote about the soiled fish of the sea. And he published this, and he was this rock star professor at a time when English professors truly were cultural doyens. And problem was he used a defective edition, and the true text says the coiled fish of the sea, and not a happy story for this and for some other reasons from which we will prescind. Mr. Matheson killed himself um, because of the opprobrium that was brought upon him. Um, didn't check his sword. Please. So Ulysses has I didn't show you Ulysses because it's not a beautiful book, as it were. But Ulysses is fascinating in its censorship and its publication history. And then unfortunately there's a very sad tale of a chap named Hans Walter Gabler, a German textual critic of great repute, who went to the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia and looked at the manuscript of Ulysses and was going to produce the new definitive, no such thing, edition. And but his time was short, and he relied on photocopies for some of his transcription. And it turned out to be deeply defective. And so and this was only discovered, of course, after many thousands were published and so on and so forth. And there were great debate. And Mr. Gobler was brought into considerable disrepute. So the story of Ulysses, from its initial attempted publication to its censorship, I mean, the initial text, as you will remember, is deeply defective in part because Joyce's handwriting is appalling, but also the compositors, the typesetters, were Italian speakers, not English speakers, and so Joyce's English was diabolically difficult for them, and so the originary text of Ulysses is profoundly defective. Gobler was going to, there are intermediate stages, of course, but Gobler was going to remedy that, but not so much. Then a scholar in Oxford published a new edition, which probably has greater reliability. But it's an ongoing problem because the transmission was so wobbly over time. That's a technical term, of course. Please. Sure. As you might imagine from the burden of my talk, I'm deeply in favor of maximum access. And sure, there have been times when things got stolen, but that's often, I mean, how many times have you walked out of the library and the guard said, yeah, fine, right? I mean, I think that we need to do a better job with library security, but I think that we need to say, the record of human aspiration and achievement belongs to all humanity. And sure, we need to protect it, and fragile things should be conserved properly and maybe not seen. But the books that I'm handing around, 1571, anybody afraid of that book? It's nothing going to happen to it when you guys handle it. Nothing, nothing. That 1788 book, it's in great shape. It's in its original binding. That's an edition binding. It's fine as it is. So we can be judicious and say, wow, this manuscript, needs to be handled in a certain way because of its fragility. This book is pretty hardy, and if we wish the public to be the future champions of the archive, of the historical record, that I would argue is part and parcel with the future of democracy, if you will, is kind of it's the seed bank of thought and language, and that record of failure and achievement, that record of suffering and triumph of the human species. And if we don't have that hybridity, and we don't have people who are champions of that hybridity, then it seems to me we're setting ourselves up for a kind of toxic monoculture. How many people know, you all know, what happened in 1845 when Mr. Douglas was going over to Dublin? The beginning of the Irish potato famine. Why did the potato famine happen? Because my last name is Suarez, and my barbaric ancestors, who were the conquistadores from Spain, saw 700 kinds of potatoes growing in terraces in the New World. Some were good at blight, some were good at warm, some were good at wet, some tasted good, some were good for infants, some were good for old people. Every family was growing 40, 50 different kinds of potatoes. My Neanderthal ancestors in the Renaissance brought back one kind of potato and sowed the seed of the Irish potato famine. Is that going to happen with the human archive? Because it could. Because it could. The great ancient historian Roger Bagnall says we should stop looking to some mythic fire at Alexandria, some hyper destructive event for the Library of Alexandria, and understand that the Library of Alexandria was destroyed from a lack of patronage, a lack of government funding, and neglect on the part of the voting public in the Roman world. They didn't care anymore, and it decayed into nothing. Could that be the fate for our human history? Very easily it could be. So I don't think it's an altruistic thing to say we need to give the public access to the record of human history. We need to inculcate in the public the conditions of possibility for them to get fired up about that historical record, so that they will be advocates for things like funding, patronage, stewardship, education. Because right now, it's not working. It's not working. We can protect the stuff to oblivion, and that's what we're doing. And that's very short-sighted. Sure. What are some of the interesting pieces I found here in the Nantucket Athenaeum? I freely confess to you none, but not because there are none, but because I haven't interrogated the archive here. I got in last night. Sure. What are some of the most interesting things I've found in special collections at the University of Virginia? Um, I think maybe one of the most interesting things is is a choir book from big, huge, what I tell my students, it's like a teleprompter, a choir book from a Franciscan community in Assisi. And it's for the antiphonal singing of the Psalms. It's made on these huge animal skins. And and hidden in the scroll work in the brightly colored pen and ink and paint in the scrollwork to make this beautiful as the monks sang the holy office to each other, um, are instructions to the illuminator. They're Franciscans, little micro instructions about how much gold was permitted for the illuminating of the different passages of the work. And so for me, here you see, and then there are notes from the illuminator explaining back, all hidden in the vine work, what he actually did. And so there's this little dialogue going on between the master of the making of the books and the illuminator who's been brought in from outside the community to say, I have made a beautiful thing for you, but I haven't made something that violates your vow of poverty. And I love the presence of the two makers, the one who creates the musical notation, who makes sure that the parchment is all as it should be, and the one who comes in for the final step to burnish the hymn to God with gold, but not too much. And that, to me, this little hidden conversation is, to me, a kind of epitome of this of my life's work, if you will, of discerning the human presences in every recorded text. And in this case, those presences tell us a lot about what people valued and how they were negotiating multiple goods in something that was absolutely central to who the community was. I'm very fond of saying to my students at the University of Virginia, the community makes the book, and the book in turn helps make the community. So there's this powerful reciprocity. That might be the case for us. You know, communities of makers make the book, but then those books help make human community. I had a lovely conversation this afternoon when I wasn't here doing research in the local bookstore, talking to one of the women in the bookstore about Abraham Verghese's 835-page novel, Covenant of Water, which I'm in the middle of. And we were able to connect because we were both interested in this book together. Books help create community, for sure. 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 That's a fantastic question. I thank you for it. So, um, uh, starting in 2009, I have been the editor in chief of the biggest digital archive in the academic world, something called Oxford Scholarly Editions Online. And we put some millions of pounds into this because the biggest publisher of medical texts in the world is Oxford University Press, and the biggest publisher of English learning texts in the world is Oxford University Press. And those are two cash cows that fund humanities projects like Oxford Scholarly Editions Online, where we have more than 2 million print pages, fully digitized and fully searchable. I have a brilliant editorial board and a fantastic team, and then a corporation called iFactory that's actually based outside of Boston is responsible for doing this. They also did the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, but I wasn't on that team. So the question, as I understand it, is that every book now starts out as a series of electronic files and is delivered as a series of electronic files for certain forms of consumption, even though it may have a print life as well. So I actually think that it's entirely possible to do this. There is a kind of a digital forensics of the digitally produced book. There's an award-winning book by a professor at College Park, Maryland, University of Maryland. The chap's name is Matt Kirschenbaum, think cherry tree. And Matthew Cherry Tree has a book called Mechanisms. And in that book, Mechanisms, chapter 3, which I warmly recommend to you, I can't help but be the professor, is called The Poetics and Bibliography of the Hard Drive. And it's all about this idea that we're no longer setting forms of type, but we're still making a whole series of decisions. I mean, I can tell you the labor that's gone into Oxford Scholarly Editions Online. Before you spend several million pounds of anybody's money, you better get it right, right? So the conversations, the correspondence, the phone calls, the decisions that have gone into that digital delivery, the decisions that have gone into linking that instantly with the OED or the Oxford Medieval Dictionary or the Dictionary of National Biography, so that you have this one seamless environment and you can be calling up Dickens and Gladstone's letters and Thackeray and George Eliot and doing a kind of a deep search on the use of a particular phrase at a particular time and seeing how this has kind of come to life in Victorian England. You could do things that you could have never done before. There are new digital affordances. But I guess what I would also want to emphasize is that the digital domain is always one of loss and gain. And we're so mindful of the gain that we forget sometimes that there's always an attendant loss. Pictures of books are not books, right? A simulacrum means that something is absent. So there are things we can do, and there are things that we can't do. There are new things that we can know, and there are things that we could never know from that digital file. And so Richard Ovenden, the head of the Oxford University Library System, has eloquently said that when he puts things in ultra high res digital files up on the web, what he finds is scholars use that, but then before they publish or when certain questions arrive, they come into the library and the use of those items that are digitized, far from going down, goes up about 8-fold because it's like this advertisement that this wonderful thing is available and can be interrogated in multiple ways. So I actually think that digital is not the enemy, but we need to remember this, if you will, economy of loss and gain, and we need to try to exploit the gains and be mindful of the losses. My fear is that the great desideratum of the digital is velocity of access. I can woefully check the Met score on my iPhone in a heartbeat and then skip a few beats when I see. But I was taught that if I gave my life over to the humanities, then perhaps if I worked very hard and was very fortunate, then maybe over time, I and perhaps even my students, if we gave ourselves over to the study of the true and the good and the beautiful, yeah, I'll say it, then maybe our lives could become a little more true and a little more good. And even our lives could perhaps become a little more beautiful. But I don't think that has anything to do with velocity of access, right? And so I worry that if we're only using digital tools, they start to drive the epistemological routines. If the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. So I want a mixed environment. I want to use those digital files and I want to use them to an inch of their life. But I also want my students to be literate in learning how to read the whole book, right? All three of those spheres that coalesce into the making of meaning. And those materially instantiated meanings are made by human beings, as are the files. And you know, Borges says that every book is a sacred object. Well, I would even argue those digital books might be considered as such, but we need to recover the human presences in those texts too, because they're there. Does that help?
Thank you so much, Michael, for sharing your knowledge and your point of view and passion. It was really fascinating and inspiring. Thank you all so
Thank you
much
very
for
much.
coming.
Thank you.